하이유가 안 알리려고 뭐 그게 진짜 모르겠네.
All right, welcome everybody to the open grand final. Congratulations to all the teams for making it this far. In opening number, we have Seoul 3. Up 2, we have KDS 4. Government, we have YUU 2. Myself and the panel of itself and get started. So I'm just saying yes, speaker for Bea, Peter, all the best. Not really. They bystanders in case of injustice are more responsible and likely by our crime or superior.
Hi, my name is Sunghyun. I'm the Prime Minister. I also just wanted to do a short spiel before I start. Because maybe a lot of people might think that I'm desensitized. I'm just like kind of chilling like KNC finals. I actually am not. I think yeah, this is also obviously KNC finals back when I was young. I never imagined to be in this place. I really hope everyone also just dream higher and also just fight harder and so that it's open to everyone. I think it's I was never to give a full shout out all who have really helped me a lot throughout my journey. The first one is Chang. I got so much blame for him for not giving a shout out in any ABC finals so I want to reciprocate for that. Obviously I also want to thank Daniel Young also for teaming up with me and also many student people who didn't bother to help me out. Two things to talk about. The first thing is this is a statement debate, this is a police debate, which means that we have to talk about in principle whether or not these bystanders are morally culpable. It's not about the practical application of this moral, this principle. Probably this is about whether or not this statement as a moral principle is a true statement or not. The second thing is our burden obviously is not to prove that these bystanders have the equal degree of moral culpability to, for example, the perpetrators of these actual injustices. Probably our burden is to prove that these people have some degree of moral culpability and these people deserve some degree of moral criticism as a result of their inaction in the circumstance of these social injustices. Obviously, under our side of the house, we believe that these people have the moral duty to do certain actions that is proportionate to their capacity. For example, doing things like #MeToo, or for example, doing things like donating some degree of money for things like people who are suffering in Palestine. All those things are probably going to be proportionate to, for example, their capacity. We're not going to, for example, say that for people who donate $1,000 a day. Probably that is not our burden. I believe rather opposition's burden is to prove that these people, bystanders in any and all circumstances, these people are not morally culpable at all, even though they have not taken any actions, even though they have not voiced anything about the current injustice that is happening, current suffering that is certainly happening right now in this status quo. The first argument, therefore, is going to prove as to why we have moral obligation to take care of others, why we obviously do have the moral obligation to actually care about other people in the end of the day. This is because of a number of reasons. The first is, obviously, I think the reason why we are not the direct target of this social injustice is because of a lot of circumstantial factors that's not a result of your, for example, effort. Because, for example, the very fact that you're born in a privileged family or born in a certain country that is not, for example, in like a good like state or whatnot, or even the, for example, like authoritarian regime, the very fact that you're born in a relatively better family to the extent that you're not the direct target of the oppression of the authoritarian regime basically means that you are actually enjoying the benefit of birth lottery or all the circumstantial factors that are uncontrollable to any of the individuals. What this basically means is that there is zero reason as to why you deserve a better treatment or better circumstances in comparison to the other people who are the direct target of all the social injustice. These people are suffering, these people are dying, these people are denied of the very basic human rights. And I think this is the very basic reason as to why we have to take care of these people. And the reason why obviously this has to extend to other people is because A, we have basic empathy to people. The reason why we care about morality is obviously because we also care about other people. We also feel, for example, that this person is going to feel bad. This person is also going to feel a lot of suffering as a result of social injustices. What this means is that in all cases, bystanders obviously have some degree of epistemic access to what extent these people are going to suffer, to what extent these people are actually going to, for example, like deprive of their basic human rights if they do not really take actions, if this particular social injustice actually continues. Which means that I think you already know, have the knowledge that this person are actually very, very suffering, but the very fact that you're taking inaction is morally unjustifiable. The next thing obviously is, probably they're going to talk about self-preservation. I believe that there obviously is self-preservation incentive. The reason why self-preservation incentive is not powerful in moral principle debate is because I think human beings are anyway arbitrary. Obviously, in my perspective, I am the most important person. But the very fact that everyone is just as equal human being as mine, and that exactly is the reason as to why a lot of other people's suffering is obviously equivalent to my degree of suffering as well. What this basically means is just because I feel like there is some degree of possibility of repercussion if I, for example, do things like voicing upwards, for example, like participating in certain action, that doesn't justify, for example, your inaction, because that obviously means that, for example, as a result of your inaction, probably a lot of people are also going to be just continue to be the target of the social injustices as well. What this means is that under our sort of house, probably people have the moral obligation to care about the others. People have the moral obligation to extend their empathy to the other people. And therefore, insofar as you know that these people are going to suffer, these people are suffering right now in the status quo, you probably need to take certain actions, given that our framing here is that these people would have to take certain actions proportionately based on their actual capacity. And note that this is not actually contingent on any of the practical outcomes, right? Because what we have actually proven to you is that insofar as you know this, insofar as you already know that these people are suffering, probably you still have some degree of moral culpability to actually just like do something. Although it doesn't really lead to practical outcomes, insofar as you already know this, insofar as you already there are so many injustices that are happening, probably you should take certain actions basically on principle. Before I move on, I'll take one from exposing if you have any.
Yeah, so are you basically culpable for every single injustice that happens in the status quo?
Yeah, I do agree. But I don't necessarily think that the degree of culpability is just the same in terms of every single instance. Probably, I think, because I already told you as to why the capacity is also going to be taken into account, and your moral culpability is also proportionate to your capacity. Probably, I think, for example, what actually is happening in, for example, like a lot of like other places is probably going to be less relevant to me in comparison to what is happening, for example, in my country or all about. The second thing I'm going to talk about is then why people should take care about the actions as well. I think this is more about the practical concerns. I'm going to also engage into that. The first thing is because I think people can make some degree of meaningful changes as a result of their actions. The reason for this is twofold. The first thing is because I think there is a possibility of collectivism. Because I think under our set of house, we don't have to actually prove that everyone is going to take part into this. But insofar as we are able to push for the narrative that everyone should be morally culpable, everyone should take the actions, we can also assume to some extent that everyone is going to take some sort of action, which means that I think some degree of collectivization can also happen. But secondly, I think in macro scale, even if you cannot collectivize and just like change all the structures, I think you can still help some degree of like individuals that are adjacent to you. For example, if you are in an authoritarian regime, or if you are, for example, like in a authoritarian regime, or for example, you're still managed to, for example, like sneak out like food to the people who are actually suffering from that. Although you cannot change the structure, I think you can still alleviate the suffering of these people to some extent, which means that I think there is an active benefit of, for example, preventing the worst case scenario for these people. The next thing to obviously talk about is about the object and possible thing that there is going to be a potential repercussion on you yourself as well. For example, when you are actually going to get blamed, or for example, you're just going to be fucked up by the authoritarian regime or whatnot. The first thing, obviously, as I have argued, is that you can obviously find ways to minimize the repercussions. But the second more important way here is about the degree and the certainty of the repercussion. Because I think under your side of the house, already suffering is happening in the status quo. Already suffering is certainly happening in the status quo. In comparison to maybe there is a possibility that you actually get repercussions or whatnot, I think uncertainty, I think there is a higher burden for you to actually at least alleviate the current things that are happening certainly in comparison to you worrying whether or not you're actually going to be might or might not be like subject to, for example, certain repercussions.
I'd like to thank the Prime Minister for that fine speech and invite our leader of opposition.
I would also like to say it's a great honor to be here. And first, I'm really nervous right now. Speech in 3, 2, 1. So first of all, we would like to give 3 pieces of rebuttals to the opening government, and then we would like to elaborate on our case, why on our side morality is better, why we would like to also prove why morality shouldn't be like work such as this shouldn't be enforced on normal people. The first point about how they suppose that these kind of people who are how they suppose the bystanders are the people under the benefit. So we believe that this is not true, and usually this is only the marginal case. Usually the bystanders are the people who are just existing in everyday lives, and even though they try to bring the case about how normal people should also intervene, we believe that this characteristics of the bystanders actually help on our side, which we elaborate in my speech later. And second of all, we believe that the stakeholder here who should be like handing this kind of like burden of solving this justice in the society. It is the oppressive society itself, not this entire one individual. Because what does this person exactly do? So if someone has the obligation to actually solve this kind of problem that you're so highlighting on, it is the state itself that should solve the problem, not this individual opting into this kind of choice, like without any like meaning to. Okay, third of all, they have tried to bring the impact of how people can keep on intervening and how they can solve these societal problems overall. But that's just, we would like to just frame that that's just basically coercing people into solving this problem without asking for their consent in the first place. So why should people be forced into this kind of morality? So we would like to impose this burden entirely on the operating government, why they should enforce this kind of morality into the people in the first place. So onto our characteristics of what morality is. So in my speech, I'm going to talk about what morality is, who the bystanders are, what is this kind of injustice is, and first of all, why this shouldn't be true on our side. So first of all, about morality. So we believe that morality only applies like fairly and justly if there's a societal agreement on this. So this applies to every single people on this. And the condition for morality to be effective is when it is able to be equally adjusted into each individual of the society. So we can like put it into education or some stuff. So because it's a societal agreement, like they claim, it has some kind of enforcement on the people. And it has some kind of harm because even if they don't want to opt into this kind of like not like incorrect morality, they are trying to label the people who are not really like incentivized to opt into this fake morality in the first place, and on their side, the people are actually going to call these people who are not opting in immoral, therefore trying to like pretend that they're moral in the first place. So therefore, we believe that this is an unfair burden they're pushing on the entire society itself. Second of all, why is the bystander? The bystanders are the people who don't intervene. But we would like to say that intervening is actually taking sacrifice and taking risk for themselves. So therefore, we would like to say by intervening, oh wait. Okay, so the reason why injustice happens in the society in the first place is the power imbalance. So we can take the marginal example of group bullying, or in the macro case, there could be power differences between like each institutions, like whether you're an employee or employer. So therefore, what we believe that the OG is pushing to us in this debate is why like they didn't really prove why like they should intervene and therefore sacrificing their own goods. So we bring two cases. The first is about our own principle of morality. The sacrifice doesn't apply to only my oneself, right? So this intervener, so this bystander, we all have interactions, we all have friends, we all have families, and therefore, if I choose the option of intervening because of the state morality imposed to me by the society, it's going to actually implement the people who are around me, like my friends or my family or like my colleagues and stuff. And these colleagues and these like people around me doesn't get the choice in choosing what I opt in to do, right? So therefore, they're only affected one-way direction by the option that I make, right? And this option that I make isn't really actually made entirely by myself. It is made by the society because of this morality that is pressured onto me. So while this is not good in the first place, intervening is evil and wrong. And we believe that intervening is prioritizing others who are related to me more than myself and the people around me who are related to me. So we would like to explain the principle of why. So in order to like create some kind of self thing, we're not created by ourselves, right? We are created because we are who we are because of the interactions we do, because of the environment we go through. So therefore, if so borrowing the OG's case, there's some empathy to each people, right? So we will also like to take this into account, and we will also like during a further analysis that people, each individual actually has more empathy to people around me than to the people who are totally unrelated to me. So right. So in this case, we would like to also one more highlight that prioritizing others more than myself is not morality, but we would like to say beginning with the closest relationship, caring for the people who are near me, this is morality itself. And also the second case about that person's situation. So we already characterized to you that this kind of injustice happens because of the power imbalance between like each individuals, right? So therefore, if the bystander choose the option to opt into this kind of intervention and help thing, then it can bring the backlash to this bystander in the first place. And we'll also like to say that they cannot give a tangible help in the first place because of the reason why I mentioned earlier, because these kind of bystanders have low possibility of having more power than the person who is enforcing this injustice into the society, right? So therefore, even if they opt into the choice of helping this kind of people, they're not going to bring the effectiveness that they're trying to claim in the first place, right? And it is actually impossible to mobilize every single one of them into a social movement in the first place, because even though you bring the principle of morality, it is the actually individual's choice to opt into the social movement, and therefore it cannot be effective because it was not by their own will, but the society has actually imposed them that you have to do this, you have to do this. So it's not the choice that I made, right? So even if they opt into help, there's not going to be tangible help because one of the power imbalance, second of it's not my self choice, and therefore I'm out of time. Prato oppose.
I'm taking my ability from
We live in a society, and that puts moral obligations to other people. It is the capitalistic system that oppresses the working class for you to get cheap goods. It is national unity and stability that you're able to enjoy due to things like nationalism that comes from scapegoating things like minorities. And this is oftentimes likely to be the case insofar as there are scarcity, insofar as there are limited resources. And that therefore that puts a moral obligation for you to act in those instances, to at least try to improve the situation and to make sure that you can at least try to reciprocate the best of your ability. Because it is the principle of reciprocity that is the first line of defense when opening government. Because it's others' oppression and others' sacrifice that gave you self-preservation in the first place, which means that oftentimes you also have the duty to make sure that you can try to at least minimize the harm and suffering that other people have to go through. The first line of reasoning from opening government is quite simple. If it is the case that the logical basis for moral codes is that if everyone did it on net it benefits society, that is congruent with this motion, because maybe individual efforts themselves do not change the entire world, But if everyone went onto the streets and started protesting, obviously governments cannot stop them all. Which means that in a world in which this moral code was widely practiced, it is likely that it would bring societal benefits, and therefore it is congruent with the ways in which to determine what to be moral and what not. And also, because as a result of inaction, you know for sure that oppression will continue to happen, and you are being okay with it, and therefore that's why we think firstly motion stands. But it is also true that in some instances, there might be limited capacities for you to change. But that does not mean that you have no capacities at all to create change or at least not make things worse. As a cadet in war, maybe you cannot go against your generals to shoot into these civilians. But there are still things you can do, like shooting upwards or shooting at non-vital spots to make sure that people aren't immediately dying. But second, you can also do things like mistakenly dropping food near marginalized communities, which means that the degree of culpability is oftentimes different depending on your situation, which means we don't have to assign the same level of culpability to everyone. But also, because when it comes to repercussion, there are things that you can do to minimize those things directly, and you have agency over those things. Because oftentimes intentions which come before action are things that are not possible to conceal from other people. When you say you mistakenly was not able to shoot someone, your general cannot punish you for not following orders. At best, what you can do is to at least, for example, get punished for being a bad shooter, or at least not get promotions for being a bad shooter. But you oftentimes have more agency over these sort of repercussions that you are likely to endure, and therefore that means that puts a moral burden. The weighing here is quite simple. These certain harms that a lot of these minorities and people who are oftentimes harmed, they have to endure, versus the uncertain repercussion that you might or might not receive. And note, even if the capacity for you to change things is limited, that does not mean that you have no moral duty at all. Because it is the effort and at least the willingness for you to try that actually matters. Because when social justice warriors fight for causes, we don't say that they were morally culpable because they did not succeed. We say that they were morally good because they at least tried, because they knew that they were benefiting from these situations from other people, that they were benefiting from the oppression of other people, and at least they gave it their best shot to make sure that they can at least try to pay back that reciprocative duty. And insofar as the reciprocative duty comes just by virtue of the fact that you're at least giving it your best shot and trying your best, I think that the mere fact that you're at least trying means that we better fulfill the moral duty, and bystanders oftentimes do not fulfill that duty. Before I move on, I'll take one from closing if there's any. 3, opening. All right. But let's say that in the worst case, these people had zero capacity to improve. These people are still culpable. And no, we're taking the absolute hardest stance here. And so if we win this using this line, then we win it in the second time as well. I think the simple reason behind this is that it is wrong to benefit or to be okay with benefiting from other people's struggles. The intuition of this is quite simple. If I steal something from Wonjae, that is obviously wrong because I am benefiting as a result of someone else's, as a result of Wonjae not having his thing. The analogy is quite simple. Maybe the people of Omelis cannot change the system, or maybe the people of Omelis cannot save the child, but they can still choose to walk away since they are stealing the happiness of the child. On our side of the house, maybe you don't get to change the system or at least improve things, but at least in the absolute worst case, you are not benefiting from the harms that other people and the oppression that other people are actively going through. Opposition has to defend a world in which they have to explain why there is zero moral culpability. Why? Despite the fact that you are benefiting massively from a lot of the oppression and harms that these people are going through, it is okay for you to be okay with staying within that system and continuing to benefit, but not to give it your best shot to at least try to help the people that you are actively benefiting and leeching off of to begin with. When someone does not fulfill a moral obligation that they have, we say that person is morally culpable. Bystanders have failed in 2 different ways. The first is that they have failed their obligation of reciprocity. When you refuse to act to prioritize, when you refuse to act in order to prioritize their self-interest, which may not or may not be at risk, but are oftentimes upheld as a result of the levers of oppression that exist in society. But they failed a second time when they failed the obligation to not unjustly benefit at others' expense. Because I think the important thing here is who you are born as, what situation you are born into, are oftentimes all arbitrary, and we oftentimes hold all humans to the same levels of morality, which means that maybe it is the case that you might be valuable, but oftentimes it is unclear as to why other people's harms and the other people's oppression are not as equally valuable. Maybe it is the case that you do owe certain things to your neighbors, but that does not mean that you don't owe other things to other people, because it could have been as a result of birth lottery, your relatives and your friends who were also as a result of that oppression. So insofar as a lot of your circumstances or what things you can do that are largely constricted are very arbitrary to begin with, I think it's the case that we should value all of these people equally, and therefore we think that bystanders oftentimes have a direct moral responsibility. At the end of the speech, you should believe three things. Firstly, the moral code is logically congruent because if everyone followed it, there would be benefits to the most marginalized. Secondly, that it is wrong for the opposition to assume that you are more special than other people, when in fact a lot of the situations were oftentimes deterministic and based on birth lottery. Thirdly, that even if all of these are not true, you are benefiting as a result of that oppression. So it is wrong for you to further prioritize your self-interest when your self-interest was upheld by those people to begin with. But fourthly, that oftentimes it is the case that at the very least, you can walk away from the injustices. You can choose to be the ones to walk away from homeless because of all these reasons proposed.
Next speaker for that final speech is Anthony.
Okay, before I start my speech, I would like to again thank you for every people who let me be here, especially for the PAT instructors who really trained me, and also my seniors, Hyeon, Songbin, Jun, and my lovely council members of KDS and every single KDS. Also, my importantly. I'm going to start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Just look at the opening government and opening opposition politely in terms of the responsibility. What opening government is mainly pushing about their own argumentation of responsibility is your responsibility toward the society. And in compared to that, our case, opening opposition's main push about the responsibility is that your responsibility toward your family and your surrounding is far bigger than your responsibility toward the society. Opening opposition is not neglecting the fact that we are the individual, but also part of the society who got severely being affected by the society in the far degree. But in compared to that, we believe that in my speech, I'm going to give a further analysis and way why the responsibility toward your surrounding and your family is far more important. Before that, I would like to engage the key pieces of the opening government, which was the responsibility as a benefited one. First of all, the mechanization, so they suggested as a beneficiary, is that those kind of people are somewhat lucky or somewhat designated to be a lucky one by the oppressive society or kind of things, or maybe the school bullies or kind of people, which means that they are also the potential victims. Under such kind of society, and considering the surrounders, bystanders are likely to be in the similar context and similar situation with the oppressors and with the victim, those kind of people are the potential victim, considering the fact that we suggested as a power imbalance in my previous speaker's speech, which means that victims, they are having a symmetricity in the harm on themselves. Yeah, the opening government is talking about the degree of the symmetricity and degree of the harm on themselves in terms of the benefit. They're trying to characterize them getting benefited as the one who has a responsibility to do so. But Judge, we'd like to argue that responsibility comes from your own will. Responsibility should be only given to the people who decided to take such kind of action by your own will. But this is not the case, because those kinds of potential victims, they did not actively like protested or worked to gain such kind of benefit. As they characterize, they're just lucky people who involuntarily became a less harmed victim, which means that we cannot just blame them for the victims being harmed, another more severe victims being harmed. So such benefit, as I mentioned before, such kind of benefit that the OG characterized in this debate is not basically by their own will. I was just designated to be, or just being lucky, which means that OG is simply trying to burden victims for involuntarily becoming less victim, trying to make them more harmed to symmetrize the degree of the harm by those kind of direct victims that is getting oppressed, which is like more unlucky victims. So moving on to our main substantive about the sacrifice. So we are all agreeing upon the point that this kind of intervention, not being a bystander, inherently includes some kind of sacrifice. What OG is pushing is that this sacrifice can be justified because basically you have a responsibility. As I mentioned before, we strongly believe that you don't have a responsibility because that is not your voluntary action. Second of all, saying that you have a responsibility toward the society, still, because it is a sacrifice, you have a stronger responsibility to not to intervene to that kind of situation. Further analysis about this
Point.
Yeah.
Why is your sacrifice more important than other people's sacrifice as a result of this social injustice?
We are talking about the individuals and how should they act in the first place. And as I mentioned before, the social injustice will harm every single part, every single entity in the society, which means that the OG's only push is about the degree of the difference. And they have to prove that the kind of difference of the degree justifies the victims to call them offenders, which is the main case of the opening government, talking of the responsibility, talking about that we should actually blame them as a more like immoral entities. So, okay, just moving on to substantive of our case. We strongly believe that the responsibility that we have to our families and surroundings are far bigger than the OJ's suggestion about responsibility toward the society. Why is that the case? Let's just look at this chamber. The reason why I am debating here and giving a speech here is not because I'm a like prodigy debater or I'm like really smart guy. It is thanks to, as I mentioned before, a lot of PhD instructors or my seniors or kind of people. And also, moving back to the general case, the reason why you are actually living and you are actually contributing or acting in the society is thanks to your family, which means that, first of all, you have a responsibility to their contribution about yourself, which means that your own life and your own benefit is something that is contributed and that also takes have a stake by your surrounding people. Which means that you cannot just dispose that kind of life and that kind of your own value without the consent of your surroundings or other entities. That is why the intervening in this kind of situation is basically immoral at the first place. And also, because sorry, just okay, talking about the relationship. As our leader of the opposition characterized, each individual as a part of the society is creating the relationship which is quite different by the individual. I have my mother, I have my father, and I have my girlfriend or like kind of friend, which means that I have a responsibility to the relationship that I created in my journey life. I cannot just dispose that relationship to fulfill a responsibility to somewhat stranger, which means that the responsibility exists bigger on your families and friends and surrounding people. And also about the other point of the uncertainty, because that is quite uncertain that you're going to be harmed or not. They're just trying to say that, oh, you may not be harmed, but the fact is that you may be harmed. So what opening government is trying to push to those kind of potential victims who involuntarily became a less harmed victims is that you should endure the possibility of your families and friends getting harmed and also yourself getting harmed. Sorry. And about the point that which was also main pushed by the opening government to find a way about this debate. Let's talk about the core problem of the societal oppressions and core problem of the school bullies or kind of every single macro or micro problems. Whether we are talking about the morality, we are talking about the culpability, which means that you are going to be able to you should attain the justification to blame someone to be immoral. Let's look at the Titanic. Do we blame the woman who get on the boat to be immoral? No, we don't. We obviously praise the people who just give them the seat, but we do not blame the people who didn't do so. Which means that maybe the opening government is successful in proving that we should praise those people who sacrifice in some kind of extent. But in compared to that, to blame people for not sacrificing themselves for protecting their families and friends who they have a strong responsibility, we cannot call them as an immoral and evil person. That is why this debate has taken by the opening opposition.
By a member of the experience.
I'll try to. Please bear with me. No. Okay, I think this semester alone, 3 consecutive finals with Wonjae. Like, honestly, a privilege to just be here. These are some great debaters that we're sharing the floor with. I'm gonna do a lot of grandstanding in my speech. Like, I don't think I'm morally qualified to make any of these points, but we'll see. Okay. All right. Okay. Right. Start my speech. 3, 2, 1. Every day we are bystanders. Every time we switch on our phones and happen to see a news article about the plight in Syria or the genocide in Palestine and we just scroll by, we are guilty. We are morally culpable. That is the burden that we're going to be pushing as CG. Every day we lose the battle of interests, right? We prioritize cheap dopamine by scrolling away from one article of Palestine and moving towards to watch Mr. Beast. Maybe we have been conditioned and subjected to these social media algorithms, but that does not remove our responsibility from uninstalling Facebook, from uninstalling TikTok, from not buying into these specific structures that prevent us from actually taking more action, to educate ourselves further, and to actually educate ourselves about the full capacity of what we can actually take and actually ensure that these institutions are not propped up. If you look at how we actually act these days, we have normalized inaction by actually using these apps. We have commercialized the act of being a bystander. The lower burden of the OG is that they advocate that the action should be proportional to capacity. The fallacy of this claim is that they have mechanized proportional action to menial acts like #MeToo or chanting out free Palestine. These simple extensions of empathy don't do anything. Because I think that if you listen to the OG speech, the lesson that you get from them is that if you did these actions, if you shared that one Instagram story, then you are not morally culpable. Then that's not what we're telling you. We tell you that simply there is no such thing as a true bystander, right? And what we call a bystander is just a warm blanket that we place on ourselves to blind ourselves and to make ourselves feel better, feel less guilty. The crux of CG's case
That's fine. That's a government. The crux of CG's case is that with knowledge comes responsibility. We push a damning responsibility on every single individual in this house. It means that your moral responsibility is activated the moment that you happen to scroll on an article about Palestine. And in that specific moment, your responsibility is activated. So the mere process of discourse on this specific action on moral culpability, the mere opening up of this question on moral culpability strikes up questions from people about the ideas of potential capacity, what it means to actually to promote social action, what role do certain people can play, how do you actually contribute and help and do your own part. At the very best, the net impact of this specific point is that we detach ourselves. Someone give me a timer, by the way. My timer stopped because of the government thing. At the very best, the net impact of this point is that there's going to be a lot more conversations regarding the definition of capacity, and as we have more conversation, the definition expands, and as it expands, so does our spectrum of actions in correlation. In a retrospective, this discourse on moral inculpability, it constantly moves. It constantly moves. I thought it was 6 minutes. So what happens is that if you have much more actions specifically on this discourse, you have much more discussions about more and more about the kinds of sacrifices you can actually take onto yourself. Because if we're being completely honest with ourselves, we can afford it, right? We can afford a little bit more personal austerity. We can afford to not drink Americanos every single day. It is by us pressuring and shaming individuals to make more and more concessions that we can actually do this. One prime example of this expansion of the definition of what proportional capacity of what just capacity actually means is boycotting. In the Palestine movement, what we see is this active campaign to try and identify specific companies that are connected to the Israeli state or its enterprises. The unique observation of this example is that oftentimes inaction is actually not a neutral action, right? It means that by us being the bystanders, not actively boycotting, by buying groceries from a mega corporation that is founded by Israel, by going to Starbucks because it's comfortable, or by building a website on Wix because it's run by an Israeli corporation, it's oftentimes these actions that we deem as bystanders, deem as neutral, are actually just not neutral and actually prop up these institutions that actually oppress individuals. This is important because it is by us being bystanders, it is by us buying and not educating ourselves about the sources of our utility, and that we are actually able to dismantle these institutions. If we do not do a retrospective and actually are pressured to actually do an evaluation of what we actually buy into, of what our sorts of utility are, then we are simply just not educating ourselves to actually dismantle these specific organizations. I think this directly engages with Suhyun's point about whether we are responsible for every single injustice in our lives. I think this question is framed. It is very hard for us individuals to answer this question because we've sort of conditioned ourselves into thinking that we are bystanders and that we can't really do anything. It is with these conditions that a lot of times our interactions we internalize a feeling of a sense of powerlessness. It's because oftentimes we place disproportional power to these specific institutions and structures, and it's by assuming that we are bystanders, by internalizing the role of a bystander, that we prop up and actually conceptualize these institutions as being too powerful to actually overthrow, and that menial actions, that these minor collective actions, will actually have no meaningful impact on these institutions, and that we deem our inactivity as reasonable, as natural, as a net. So the net consequence is that we just create much less action, and we just get much less action in our world. We are in their world. We are held responsible for all the injustices because we have indirectly propped up institutions that directly benefit the oppressors, the warmongers, the Assads and the Netanyahus of our world, because they are invested in these companies. They are networked across our many sources of utility, whether that be Facebook, whether they are groceries, whether that be our daily lives. They are networked across all of these specific things because maybe we just didn't know, right? It is not a sin to not know, but it is a sin to try to not know. It's a sin. Okay, sure, you are. Yeah.
If you're a person who is not educated about any of these things that happen in the globe, are you morally culpable because you're uneducated?
I reject that premise because there's a fallacy to assume that we don't have the means to educate ourselves. It is a fallacy to assume that we cannot go on Google and actually search up ways we can boycott or actually help the Palestine movement. Because honestly, who in this house have actually Googled how we can help Palestine? Maybe we see the news and we actually see, oh, we're sad. I'm very sad. I show my tragedy. I express my empathy empathy. I will share this story. But do we really talk about capacity? It is by expanding our definition of capacity. It is by expanding our conversations on our individual capacity and understanding the sources of what our capacity is. That is how we actually convert it to meaningful action. Because the entire opening clash was about proportional capacity. This entire life argumentation only stands if we assume that individuals have full knowledge about what they're capable in the first place. But do we really know our full capacity? Do we actually make attempts to know our capacity? No. Now, do I think that me saying all this will change any of this? No. Since this is not a policy motion, I don't need to stand here and tell you that there's going to be some meaningful social change. It is not. I think it's going to be enough for our simple case to shame all of us to try and educate ourselves, to not be blinded to the fact that there are network effects that these oppressors benefit from, and that we shouldn't be saying still. Thank you.
We can invite our member officers here.
Starting my speech. From the scale of doing an incredible, infinite amount of effort to do something to like the worst possible case action possible, we think that there is an infinite scale of different actions you can take in between, and with that, an infinite number of possibilities. So, if there is a robber who comes into my house and says, hey, choose between me shooting your mom or shooting your dad, I think that I could have the choice of saying, oh no, I'm so sad. And then OG would absolve me of my moral responsibility because I did something, right? I said, please don't. And then Seijin would say that it is my responsibility to go attack that burglar, like do the utmost to kind of make sure that they don't kill my parents, meaning that probably all three of us would die, right? We think that somewhere in between this, they're missing some kind of. So we're going to give you this thing, right? Because we think that moral responsibility and moral culpability is actually like very different from just like saying you should take the most optimal course of action, or you should at least do like something, or at least like not make it worse, right? What do we think moral culpability is? We think that moral culpability is when one, your actions directly cause the issue, and two, when you have like actually the capacity to have changed this, but you choose not to, right? This is very important because we're going to talk about this later on as well. So we think that there's actually a much higher burden to make someone morally culpable than just saying like, you didn't do the best possible thing, you caused something to happen in a certain way. I think that's just kind of ridiculous coming from government. All right, so then our first unique extension is that we think that you are not morally culpable for being a bystander in the face of injustice, because in the first place, you never consented to being put in that situation. Right? If somebody puts me in front of like a trolley problem and says, would you push the lever? Like someone's gonna die, someone's gonna die either way, right? I don't think that either way can make a decision that makes me morally culpable, because I was not the one who like made this trolley issue, right? I was forced into this decision, and in that way, I'm equally a victim of having to make this like bad choice. And so the immorality or the moral culpability falls on whatever has like forced me to be in this situation. So why does this mean that I'm like not morally culpable? I think this means like because I was equally unjustly put into this situation, it is very unfair to blame me or put like moral culpability onto my actions when I was also a victim, and I also was like I also never like consented or contributed to making this happen in the first place. And then our second thing is we think that while O did a pretty good job, we also kind of missed why like this is unlikely to happen and why we're also victims. Okay, so then second is, why is it that it is a futile resistance, and this futile resistance that benefits no one is not moral, and rather it is immoral to put moral responsibility on people who are also victims of the system. So why is this futile resistance, and why are we unlikely to get changed as a bystander if we like actually try to do something, whether it be like putting the hashtag or trying to like tackle the burglar, right? We think a couple of reasons. First, we think that when there is this kind of injustice, it's pretty likely to assume that there is some level of like power asymmetry. There's some entity that has the power, that has the capacity and the will
to like do something, right? And because they're in the position to make these injustices happen, we think that these same structures of power and these same structures of like capacity and injustice apply equally to you, right? Why is the victim not able to rise to be like, hey, screw you, right? We think that it's because the person has like a very definite difference of power and has some kind of like kind of monopoly on the power of the situation. We think that if you exist in that same world, you're also subject to those same systems of power. You're also subject to like all of those inequalities. I don't think that I really understand like government's characteristics of, oh, but you're like benefiting from it, insofar as we're also like potentially victims of that. And as soon as we try to step up and like change that, we become active victims of that as well. I don't know how we can actually change this system just by saying like hashtag, right? But then, why do we think that this is actually likely to create harm for us on a personal level? We think that when this is like, did you have Pyun?
Yeah. Maybe you don't have capacity to make direct change, but you do have capacity to educate yourself about ways to not indirectly benefit your oppressors.
Okay, I think one, like I'm not, okay, so I think one, you're basically saying you have, your argument was that you have the moral responsibility to educate yourself, and then you'll say, insofar as we know that this is an issue, you have a moral responsibility to fix it. Right? I think you're basically just saying like you have moral responsibility. I think you just like set that in a fancy way. But I think that like for a lot of people, like just educating yourself is also just on that scale of like how much should you do to fix it, right? I have the capability right now to like fly to Africa or like fly to some other country and like actively try to build houses, right? It wouldn't kill me. I have the capacity to do this, but I don't think that I have the moral capability to do this because it's not my fault. Sorry, it's not my fault. So I think that there's a very big difference between like the optimal course of action and like, yeah, this would probably be a very good thing if you did this, and then the very, very large gap to like you are morally culpable because you haven't done this. We think there's a really big gap to try to bridge, and we think it's an error that government and both branches of government try to just like equate this and say there's no gap, that is the gap, right? If there was something you could have done, but you just didn't do it, and you were capable of doing it, then you're morally responsible. We think that's an issue. Yeah.
You being put in such situation is arbitrary, of course, but the degree to which people are being oppressed within the circumstance is different. Regardless of whether you chose to be in a suboptimal situation, the fact that you are still benefiting more as a result of those circumstances is still different, right?
Okay, but under that logic, every single person except for the most suffering, like the one individual who suffers the most, is morally culpable for like all of that other suffering, right? But then I think that's really unrealistic, also like a really small margin of time on which you're trying to win here. Because then if everyone is just very morally responsible for everything except for the most suffering person in the world, I'm not really sure like what else you can say on that. I think what's more meaningful to discuss is that if you're like to a meaningful extent morally culpable to something rather than just like, yeah, but you're lucky, so now you're at fault, right? I think you need to do more than that to make you morally culpable for like someone suffering. Because I'm also suffering, and like if you say even if you're suffering, you're responsible, then basically everybody's responsible. So at the end of the day, I think there are two there's basically one thing that we want to like really impress upon you, which is that just because there is some optimal course of action, which actually is quite arbitrary and I also don't know, that doesn't mean that I have moral culpability to like moral responsibility to pursue that action. And because we are also victims in this situation, because we haven't consented to being put in this situation, we think it is morally wrong to push this kind of moral culpability onto the people who are equally victims of this situation and injustice in the first place. Because of that, so proud to oppose.
Each type of government, we have our government.
This is my fourth internship final. Well, and I have been opposing government 3 times. Government's 1 time. Okay, but I'm still very grateful to be here. I think I need to thank Joonseo, obviously, but also Hyeon, that's not here. He's my teammate for the 3 other tournaments to help us improve, and also our YUU people there that is supporting us. Yeah.
And because I'm EFL, I might be really puzzled if you like hear my speech. So if you do not like react to my speech, that would be really grateful. There. The way how CG enters this debate is by telling you that capability is not a reason for you to not have a responsibility. I think that what the problem that all the three teams has is having capability of metric inside your responsibility. We say that what Joonseo says is that you always have a capability to do something, right? What we say is it is not about like fulfilling your moral obligation, but about you should always believe that you are a bystander to something. You will never fulfill your moral obligation. You will never stop being a bystander. But the process of this moral cultivation is something that continuously becomes an incentive for individuals to educate myself. This go on to participate in social discourses. And by you being continuous this bystanders, and by the society viewing that as a morally culpable thing, that responsibility will never be fulfilled, but something that is clearly beneficial for yourself and a society, and something that is principally a responsibility. The first thing I will do is observe the opening debate. I think what OG successfully does is prove why there's moral obligation to other individuals within your capability. But if this is the question, I think O has a correct point that if such moral obligations collide with each other, if your family is the ones that are hurting by, for example, sneaking out food, then why should you still have that obligation to do so? And closing extends on the same point, right? They never respond because their metric is still upon capability. The reason how we break this deadlock is because what Joonseo tells you is telling you why you will never fulfill this obligation. What we tell you is that when we face a situation that is socially unjust, what we need to do is have a continuous active effort. We need to continuously do something and try to fulfill that some kind of obligation that will be never fulfilled. What Joonseo tells you is not the result. We're not telling you that some kind of action of punching the burglar is something that is a good thing. But we can still principally tell you that you will always have an obligation and responsibility to punch that person, and you should always improve and incentivize yourself to match that level and improve into getting closer to that more obligated or more like better individuals that you can become. We say that we're not talking about the end result because this motion is not talking about that. We're talking about the process in it itself. When you are viewed as a moral culprit and when you are given that guilt, you will continuously try to match that vision of what Jasmine tells you. And that's something that is clearly beneficial, right? So what we do is I think two things. One, what we say is that the current society is largely internalizing that powerlessness. I think what OG never proves, and also the opposition side doesn't prove, is if you give up your responsibility or believe that that is not morally culpable, just because you cannot do that, you are being directly imposed into what social media is doing to you. You just believe that you fulfill a minimal level of moral obligation. What we should say is we should maximize that. You should be always feeling some kind of moral obligation to do something. You should always try to work on something in order to create a better society, or not better society, to fulfill your responsibility in it itself. Then what I will explain is what kind of society that we are perpetuating for, right? What Joonseo tells you is that if you're,
if you punch the offender, basically, won't you be hit back with a stronger punch?
I'm not talking about the result, upon what you should do. We do not have a burden to prove why punching that burglar is a good thing. But what we need to prove is why that process of you being justified to punch, you being like obligated to punch that burglar itself becomes an incentive for yourself to meet your moral deeds, meet your moral improvements. And I said that that process in it itself is very beneficial. So what does this process look like? We see that what Joonseo tells you is that there will be much more discourse inside what this bystanding in it itself is, right? When we talk about bystanders, when you are talking about guilt, this does not become something like we fulfill the minimum, so that is fine. You will always be talking about what kind of situations you are bystanding, in what cases we are bystanding, and a lot of cases that will lead to what Joonseo talks about we are bystanders for everything, right? As we see in social media, even if you're living in Africa, you do not have social media, obviously the situation that you are exposed in is something that you should not give up, but always act for working for a better society. Always you should try to internalize the need to improve. You are being guilty of not acting or giving up. So those kind of actions of internalizing the give up and internalizing your powerlessness is something that is largely harmful, right? So two, when we talk about like how this impacts, I think we can also talk about social highlights and social leverages against it. We think that something that's really intuitive, that people find like morally culpable things as something that's really interesting, right? We find that when you are able to attack another person from doing that, or try to at least internalize that attack, people are just genuinely more interested in what we're talking about. People are genuinely more insistent on what we are ignoring about. Inside those situations, even if you do not punch that criminal, if the society has a shared interest that maybe you shouldn't punch that criminal because that is something that's morally justified, then individuals will simply have more leverages, or the society will simply have more leverages upon what individuals should do and more attention. And that attention, in a lot of cases, become actual hubs for your capacities to improve. So even if the weighting is set here, so even if we say that capacity is a better some kind of responsibility, I don't know what that does, but if capability is something that is standard, what we do in our society is make that capability improve, right? Because we see that as a society where these people are not morally culpable, is a society that we can really easily agree on what your situation is upon because there's a really good and easy logic for yourself to give up because you do not have a capability to do so, right? Ultimately, what we prove at this moment, before going on to direct responses into opening opposition, is that closing government is not only the only team that provides why being morally culpable is something that is actively benefiting your society. Even if you cannot do that with your capabilities, you should always ask for it. Notice that all these cases really low burden. You just say that you also have some kind of moral obligation. You say that that's just a fact, not some kind of argument that you need to prove. But what we also prove is even if we say that capacity is something that's a good standard, we do it better in a society that has more attention to it, and individuals always feel that you're a bystander outside a certain kind of situation. And moving on to some direct responses. I think opening opposition and closing opposition both agrees that there are some cases that you cannot work. One, we say that oftentimes that's false. Joonseo tells you that even if you're inside the most socially vulnerable individuals, there are always rooms for you to more be attentive about the society. If you do not have a TV, maybe you can just go to the neighborhood and ask what they are having a problem with. In a lot of cases, certain efforts are something that is given up because you think that doing nothing is principally and morally justified. You say that you cannot just say that certain stuff you cannot do that. You are justified to not do something. Two, even if we say that you can ultimately not do something like in the opposition case, well, our case is not contingent of you doing something. Our case is telling you that the process of in itself is much better. Because even if you do not really achieve to do that, you will be more socially attached, you will be more socially attentive, and that attachment and connection normally brings you not only more incentive, but structural support for you as well, because the society will be also interested to you as much as you be interested in the society, right? Because the society is always interested on what individuals find guilty or what individuals find attentive to. We not only create a better society in our world because we're the only team that is upon this metric of capability, but we just win on their grounds as well. Please over to you.
I'm speaking to wrap up off-bench and debate as a whole upward period.
The first contribution that comes from closing opposition is I think that we differentiate what moral culpability means from having you doing a good moral course of action. And I think that we should really critically buy this in this debate because none other teams really define what moral culpability is. They just assert that you doing a morally good thing is a morally good thing, so you not doing a morally good thing is actually a morally bad thing, right? I think that this logic is kind of weird. It has gaps, obvious gaps in the logic, but no other team really points out what this exact gap is. I think that is the first contribution that comes from closing opposition. Because if we were to follow opening government's logic, it would be morally culpable for me to not to donate all my organs because I can actually do so. They say this does not necessarily depend on capability. Because there are infinite course of things that you can do or you cannot do, but still the moral culpability, but still even something is morally a good thing, not doing something does not mean you're a morally bad person. We told you that moral culpability depends on two very specific standards in the status quo, and this is how we judge people to be morally culpable. Firstly, if you have the agency and the ability to actually create that event, and secondly, do you have the capacity to actually stop that event from happening? And I think that we tell you why we win on these moral standards. So I want to just so the first thing I want to do is I want to engage with opening government because I think that they give a very flimsy case by telling us that moral culpability is something that individuals have, but it still depends on their capability. Presumably, if we flip this means that because moral culpability depends on your capability to do actions, if we can prove to you why this capability isn't present, we can also prove to you why this moral event does not happen, like moral culpability does not happen. But then, I want to first engage in this weird framing that Daniel gives us. He says, if everybody's same actions gives you a congruent benefit, that means that this is a good thing, and if you don't do that, it's a morally bad thing. Firstly, you having the consequences of doing a morally good action does not necessarily mean that you don't have this does not logically equate to you not doing a morally culpable action, right? But then the second thing I want to talk about here is that the reason why that argument of that birth lottery and how you're benefited from this birth lottery does not work is because many times people injustices are very subjective to the people who perceive those injustices. Injustices are very subjective and very personal to many people who actually suffer from these injustices. This means that many people around the globe are facing injustices either structurally or either socially. This does not equate to the fact that we are accountable for these moral injustices because all of these injustices are present. And secondly, I think that because injustice is very subjective and very personal, we are the people who are also facing certain injustices in the status quo. Some might think that it is an injustice for I, as a woman, to not get fair chances in the society. Some might think it's not. Some might think that it is an injustice for other people to face some kind of things in society. This is all personal. I think that just because you see just because you're a different position in that person does not automatically say that you are a bystander to the specific injustices that people face. This does not equate to you having been a very big moral culpability to all of the injustices that actually happen around the globe. I don't think that they ever bridge that gap. It would be a good thing to help another person bridge his moral injustice and help them out of that situation. But this, just because you did not choose to do so does not mean that you have the moral culpability because you didn't help that subjective injustice for another person. I don't think that they actually make that. So this is why the principle that comes from opening government is extremely black and white. They say some people are benefited from birth lottery, some people are not. I think Jasmine gave you the analysis of why this is not necessarily true. According to their logic, we would just be helping the most vulnerable people on the globe, like the poorest person on earth. This is probably not true because we do not have the specific moral culpability to help these individuals as long as we are also facing injustices in the system. Note that this goes over opening opposition because they simply assert that, oh, you didn't choose to be in this situation, you didn't have the agency. We proved to you why. This is actually debate-winning material because moral culpability is something that actually is defined by very specific standards that we give you. This means that you are morally culpable. You are not morally culpable just because you cannot change the course of action.
Point.
I'll take one opening.
Inaction is not neutral in this case, since inaction leads to the perpetuation and continuation of injustices. Therefore, it is false that taking actions are just morally desirable. Inaction deserves moral criticism, and action is a moral duty and obligation.
Yeah, okay, that's okay. So now I want to engage to that premise because I think that the second premise that opening government and government action as a whole gives us is that inaction actually prolongates the situation, and it prolongates the situation. The first thing I want to talk about here is that this stance when the person who is actually committing the inaction has the ability or the capability to change the things that are going on within society. And I think that opening government doesn't really prove why this actually changes. We're going to tell you why. Firstly, it is very, very likely for one individual in society to not be able to have the capacity to change things against the social structure. Just because you're living in the structure, because you also face certain injustices from the structure, you do not have the capability, you do not have the ability to change the things or stop the injustices that are going on within the society. But then, secondly, the example Daniel gives us about how a person is shooting a gun is probably not a bystander. If you're shooting a gun, you're not a bystander, probably. You're probably a person who is actively provoking that situation. You're killing a person, then you probably have the moral obligation to lessen the harms that you inflict on a person. But the point at which you are a bystander, and the point at which you are actually not contributing to that situation in any significant way, just because it doesn't mean that this is something that should happen. But then I would like to flip OG's weighing here, because they say, oh, because the risks are speculative, this means that you do not have to try to change. You still have to try to change the situation because the risks are speculative, right? I would say that the results that would happen from your inaction is also very speculative. Just because you go onto the streets and protest doesn't mean that the situation will change, because you are an individual, are one individual who is living in the society. I think that you not doing something does not necessarily mean that you can contribute significantly to change the situation. Then we have to weigh this upon your likelihood of risk that you will probably face in that situation. We think that if you weigh the likelihood of risk you will probably face in the situation because you act out or act to a significant degree to fix that injustice, compared to the likelihood of the situation actually changing because you actually go out and protest, the former is much bigger of a likelihood, much bigger of an individual risk that we put on the individual. At the end of the day, moral culpability has to be culpable to your actions. You should benefit more from what you can actually do to society compared to the risk and your agency that you caused that situation. I think that we proved to you why you not doing a morally good thing is actually something that is not, something does not equate to moral harms. And I think that when it comes to moral harms, you have very specific standards that they never prove why this category can actually fit a bystander. So what you should buy uniquely from clothing all this is thank you.
수고하셨습니다.